On my son's wedding day, he allowed his new wife to introduce me to a room full of Charleston's high society, not as his mother, but as the maid. The words sliced through the music and laughter, sharp and cold, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't a wedding. It was an execution of my place in the family, and my own son had just handed them the axe. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The oppressive weight of a Charleston June afternoon clung to me, even in the chilled, conditioned air of the hotel ballroom. Outside, the sun beat down on the historic cobblestone streets, making the air thick enough to drink. Inside, crystal chandeliers dripped light onto polished marble floors, and the gentle melody of a string quartet wove through the polite murmur of conversations. It was a world of immense wealth and curated perfection, a world far removed from my quiet life surrounded by books and memories. I felt out of place in my simple lavender-colored dress. It was elegant, I thought, but it was a quiet elegance, a whisper in a room of loud declarations. My fingers, knotted with age, nervously clutched the worn leather of my old handbag as I scanned the crowd for my son. And then I saw him, Edward. He stood tall and handsome in his tuxedo, a man I had raised, a man whose every success had been my deepest pride. Beside him stood Clara, radiant and stunning in a wedding gown that likely cost more than my car. They were a portrait of happiness, a perfect couple poised on the brink of a beautiful life together. A wave of maternal love swelled in my chest, a familiar warmth that momentarily pushed aside the strange, formless anxiety that had been my shadow for weeks. I started towards them, a smile forming on my lips. I just wanted a moment, a brief embrace, a chance to tell him how much I loved him, how profoundly happy I was for him. But I stopped before I got close. Our eyes met across the room, just for a second. There was no warmth in his gaze, no happy recognition. It was a quick, cold flicker of acknowledgement. And then he gave Clara the slightest, most discreet nod. It was a gesture so small it was almost nothing. But to me, it was a signal, a silent command. I saw it. Instantly, Clara beckoned a nearby waiter. Her voice, though not loud, was pitched to carry a clear, bell-like tone that cut through the ambient noise. She gestured vaguely in my direction, a flick of a perfectly manicured hand. "That old woman," she announced, her voice dripping with a sweet, dismissive poison, "is the family's maid. Please don't speak to her." The waltz seemed to stutter and die. The hum of conversation around me faded into a thick, buzzing silence in my ears. I stood frozen, my knuckles white as I gripped my handbag. Every head in our vicinity turned. I saw it all in their eyes. Raw curiosity, a flash of pity, and in some, a flicker of cruel amusement. A cold, sickening wave of humiliation washed over me, so intense it made me physically shiver in the warm room. Clara's words were a brutal blow, but it was Edward's nod that was the true dagger. Her words were the arrow, but his silent permission was the hand that had drawn the bow. It was a calculated act of betrayal. I watched, paralyzed, as a woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion. "Oh my," she whispered, not quietly enough. "I could have sworn that was the groom's mother." The ultimate cruelty, however, was what happened next. Edward didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He didn't even look at me again. He simply placed a proprietary hand on Clara's back and guided her towards the dance floor, turning his back on me completely. He left me standing there, alone, exposed under the weight of 100 judging stares. He had made his choice. He had chosen his side. In that moment, standing amidst the splendor of my son's wedding reception, my heart didn't just break. It shattered. The pain was sharp and absolute, a physical agony in my chest. And through that pain, a terrifying clarity emerged. This elaborate, expensive celebration wasn't about love or family. It was the first move in a war I hadn't even known was being waged against me. And the person leading the enemy charge was my own flesh and blood. 2 weeks before the wedding, my house was filled with a fragile, hopeful light. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the thick leaves of the ancient oak trees in the yard, cast a warm, golden glow across the living room. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old books. This house wasn't just stone and wood. It was a library of my life's memories, and I was preparing to add a happy new chapter. In the center of the room, like a queen holding court, stood a mannequin draped in Clara's wedding gown. It was a magnificent creation of silk and lace, ostentatious and impossibly white against the dark, aged wood of my furniture. I'd been carefully dusting around it, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at that dress and saw a fresh start, a promise of grandchildren's laughter echoing through these old halls. I was so caught up in this daydream that I didn't hear Edward come in. "Mom?" I turned, a little startled, to see him standing in the doorway, a soft smile on his face. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. His embrace felt real, warm, and for a moment, all the nagging unease I'd been feeling lately simply melted away. "You shouldn't be working so hard," he murmured into my hair. "Clara wants everything to be perfect. She's got it all under control, so you don't have to worry about a thing. Just put your feet up and relax." His words were like a balm to my anxious heart. My son, my thoughtful, loving son. I felt a swell of emotion so strong it brought tears to my eyes. I turned in his arms and patted his cheek. "I'm just happy, dear. So very happy for you both." It was then that the idea came to me, a spontaneous, heartfelt gesture. "Wait right here," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I hurried to my bedroom and opened an old, cedar-lined chest. Inside, nestled in a velvet box, was the pearl necklace my own mother had worn on her wedding day, and her mother before her. It wasn't extravagant, but it was a piece of our family, a string of memories and love passed down through generations. When I returned, Clara had just arrived, looking effortlessly chic in a linen dress. She was talking to Edward, her hand resting on his arm. They looked so perfect together. "Clara, my dear," I began, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the box. "I want you to have this, to wear on your wedding day, as a welcome to the family." I held out the necklace. The pearls glowed with a soft, milky luminescence in the afternoon light. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of something in Clara's eyes. Not surprise, not gratitude, but something cool and appraising, like a pawnbroker examining a piece for its resale value. But the look vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a dazzling smile. "Oh, Margaret," she gushed, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I'm speechless." She took the box from my hands, her fingers brushing against mine. Her touch was cold. She allowed me to fasten the clasp around her neck. The pearls, which had always looked so warm against my mother's skin, seemed stark and out of place against hers. "Thank you," she said, looking at her reflection in the hallway mirror, turning her head from side to side. "It's perfect." Edward beamed at me over her shoulder. "See, Mom? I told you she'd love it. You two are going to be thick as thieves." Watching them then, my son and his beautiful bride-to-be, I was filled with a profound sense of peace. I was a mother who had successfully raised her son and was now passing the torch, entrusting him to a new woman. I was blind, blissfully and completely blind to the fact that I wasn't handing over a torch. I was handing my most precious treasures over to the enemy. A week before the wedding, I sought refuge from the mounting chaos at a small garden cafe tucked away on a quiet, jasmine-lined street. It was my favorite spot, a tranquil oasis where the only sounds were the clinking of spoons against porcelain and the gentle rustle of palmetto leaves in the breeze. With a book in one hand and a glass of sweet tea in the other, I felt a semblance of my normal, peaceful life returning. I was lost in a chapter when a familiar laugh, high-pitched and a little too loud, cut through the calm. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I looked up and saw her, Clara. She was seated at a secluded table in the far corner, partially hidden behind a large potted fern. But she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man I'd never seen before. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, dressed in a tailored gray suit that must have been suffocating in the Charleston humidity. Everything about him screamed money and power, from his expensive watch to the cold, predatory stillness in his posture. He looked utterly out of place in the relaxed, sun-dappled courtyard. I instinctively shrank back in my seat, feeling like an intruder. My first thought was to go over and say hello, but something stopped me. This wasn't a friendly chat over coffee. Clara's entire demeanor was different. The sugary sweetness she usually wore like a perfume was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She was leaning forward, her expression taut and serious. They weren't friends. This was business. I couldn't hear their words, but I watched, mesmerized, as their silent play unfolded. The man, Vance, as I would later learn his name was, did most of the listening, his face an unreadable mask. Clara did the talking, gesturing emphatically with her hands. At one point, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small rolled-up piece of paper, securing it with a rubber band. From my vantage point, it looked exactly like a blueprint. A floor plan. She slid it across the table. The man didn't open it. He simply picked it up, weighed it in his hand for a moment, and then slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The gesture was so smooth, so final. The conversation seemed to conclude shortly after that. They both stood and he extended his hand. Clara took it, and they shared a handshake that was brisk, firm, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the handshake of a deal being closed. He left without a backward glance, disappearing onto the street. Clara remained standing for a moment, her back to me. I saw her shoulders slump slightly, as if a great weight had been lifted, or perhaps settled. Then she took a deep breath, composed herself, and when she turned, the brilliant, empty smile was back in place. I quickly looked down at my book, my heart hammering against my ribs. Who was that man? What was on that paper? My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. He's a wedding coordinator, I told myself. Or maybe a caterer. The paper was probably a seating chart, but the explanation felt thin. A flimsy bandage on a deep wound of suspicion. Caterers don't wear $1,000 suits, and you don't conduct a meeting about seating charts with the clandestine air of spies exchanging state secrets. The image of his cold, assessing eyes and Clara's strained, serious face was burned into my mind. I tried to push it away, to dismiss it as pre-wedding jitters making me paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was the first deep crack in the perfect facade of our happy new family, and a cold dread began to seep through. The air inside the old stone church was thick with the scent of beeswax and history. Sunlight, stained jewel-toned by the tall Gothic windows, pooled on the worn wooden pews. It should have felt peaceful, reverent. Instead, it felt suffocating. We were there for the wedding rehearsal, a final walkthrough before the big day. But the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. It was tense, coiled like a spring. A brisk, impossibly organized woman with a clipboard, the wedding planner, was directing everyone to their places. "Bridal party on the left, groomsmen on the right," she chirped, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. When it was my turn, she glanced at her chart, then pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards the very back of the church. "And you, ma'am, will be right here in the last row." I blinked, certain I had misheard. The last row was reserved for distant acquaintances, not the mother of the groom. I managed a polite, questioning smile. "Oh, I think there must be a mistake. I'm Margaret Ellison, Edward's mother." The planner didn't even look up from her clipboard. "No mistake. Per the bride's instructions." Just then, Clara glided over, her heels clicking softly on the stone floor. She laid a hand on my arm, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. "It's for the photographs, Margaret," she explained, her voice syrupy sweet. "We need to optimize the angles from the altar. The photographer said it would create a much cleaner, more aesthetically pleasing shot." The excuse was so slick, so perfectly crafted to sound reasonable, that it took my breath away. A cleaner shot. As if my presence, my face in the front row, was a blemish to be erased. The insult was so profound, so cleverly disguised as logistical planning, that I didn't know how to respond. My eyes darted to Edward, who was standing nearby, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with his best man. I looked at him, pleading silently for him to intervene, to correct this absurdity. "Say something," my heart screamed. "Tell them I'm your mother." He must have felt my gaze because he finally turned, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. His focus was fixed somewhere over my shoulder, on a stained glass depiction of a saint. "Mom," he said, and the impatience in his voice was like a slap. "It's just the rehearsal. It's not a big deal. Let's just get through this." That was it. The first cut. Sharp and deep. This wasn't an oversight by a wedding planner. This wasn't Clara being a demanding bridezilla. This was a deliberate, calculated act of exclusion, and my own son was sanctioning it. His refusal to meet my eyes told me everything I needed to know. He was ashamed of me, or worse, he simply didn't care. I felt the blood drain from my face. I forced a smile that felt brittle, like it might crack and fall from my lips. "Of course, dear," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "Whatever Clara wants." I turned and walked the long, lonely aisle to the back of the church. Each step felt heavier than the last. I sank into the hard wooden pew, my handbag clutched in my lap. My hand, hidden from view inside my coat pocket, was trembling uncontrollably. From the back of the church, I watched them all, my son, his future wife, their friends, laughing and arranging themselves at the front. They looked like a beautiful, happy family. And I, his mother, was nothing more than a stranger, an inconvenient spectator at the celebration of my own erasure. The world snapped back into focus with brutal clarity. The buzzing in my ears subsided, replaced by a far worse sound, the low, venomous hum of whispers. Clara's words, "That old woman is the maid," hung in the air, shimmering like heat haze. They were an impossible thing to take back. An unringable bell. I stood rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on me. They were no longer looks of simple curiosity. Now they were painted with pity, contempt, and a kind of morbid fascination. I was the evening's entertainment. My gaze was locked on my son, my last hope. I prayed for a flicker of defiance, a spark of the loyalty I had poured into him for 42 years. I prayed he would turn, laugh it off as a terrible joke, and pull me into a hug. He did nothing. He stood beside his bride, his face a smooth, handsome mask, Then, a woman at a nearby table, dripping in diamonds and disdain, leaned toward her friend and spoke in a stage whisper that carried across the room. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice laced with mock surprise. "I could have sworn that was the groom's mother." Her friend tittered, a sound like breaking glass. The comment was the final twist of the knife, adding public mockery to the initial injury. The humiliation was now complete, a thick, suffocating blanket. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to flee the ballroom and the crushing weight of their judgment. But I couldn't move. I could only watch my son. And what he did next was worse than any insult Clara could ever conceive. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even grant me a final glance. Instead, Edward smiled, a tight, polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. He placed a hand on the small of Clara's back, a gesture that was both possessive and dismissive. Then, he turned his back on me. He turned, and with his bride on his arm, he walked toward the stage at the front of the room, leaving me completely and utterly alone in his wake. That was the fatal blow, the coup de grace. Clara's words had been the poison, but Edward turning his back, that was the moment my heart stopped beating and shattered into a million pieces. It was a deliberate public disowning. In that single, fluid motion, he had severed the cord that bound us, tossing me aside like a piece of trash. I finally understood. My son wasn't a weak man being manipulated by a conniving woman. He wasn't a bystander in his own life. He was a willing participant, an accomplice. He had looked me in the eye just moments before, and in that brief glance, he had condemned me. He had chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. The band started playing again, a cheerful, upbeat tune. The guests, their moment of drama over, turned their attention to the happy couple now stepping into the spotlight on stage. Laughter and applause filled the air, a tidal wave of sound that washed over me. But I felt none of it. I was an island of silent agony in a sea of celebration, a ghost at my own son's wedding. The life I thought I had, the son I thought I knew, it had all been an illusion. And the truth, in its terrible, stark reality, was more painful than I could have ever imagined. I don't remember walking out of the ballroom. My body moved on its own, a machine carrying a shattered heart, navigating through the maze of tables and smiling faces until I pushed through a set of glass doors and stumbled out into the night. The garden was a stark contrast to the gilded cage I'd just escaped. Here, the air was heavy and humid, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of night-blooming jasmine. A cold, indifferent moon hung in the inky sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns. I found a stone bench tucked away in a dark alcove, hidden from the main patio, and sank onto it, the cold stone seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. I thought I would cry, that the tears I'd been holding back would finally break free in a tidal wave of grief. But they didn't come. I was hollow, a vessel scoured clean by pain. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the distant, muffled pulse of the music from the party. Then, I heard voices. They were low and urgent, coming from just around the corner, behind a thick wall of manicured hedges. It was Edward and Clara. "Have to be careful," Clara was saying, her voice a sharp, impatient hiss. The manufactured sweetness was gone, replaced by cold, hard steel. "Careful?" Edward's voice was strained, tight with a panic I had never heard from him before. "Vance is losing patience. He's been breathing down my neck for weeks. After this wedding is over, we have to find that secret room, immediately." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Secret room? Vance? It was the man from the cafe. My mind reeled, trying to piece it all together. Clara scoffed, a sound utterly devoid of warmth. "Relax," she said, her tone condescending, as if speaking to a child. "Your mother is a soft touch. She'll break. A little pressure, a few crocodile tears, and she'll tell us exactly where your father hid everything. The house is just the appetizer. The workshop is the main course." She paused, and I could practically hear the cruel smile in her voice. "Just as long as you don't go soft on me, Eddie. You need to keep your eyes on the prize." That was it. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the full, monstrous picture was revealed. It wasn't just about the house. It was never just about the house. There was something more, a secret my husband had kept, a legacy they were trying to steal. And my son wasn't a pawn. He was a king in this treacherous game, a willing co-conspirator from the very beginning. The truth didn't just hurt. It was a bucket of ice water thrown in my face, shocking me out of my grief and into a state of horrifying clarity. The pain was still there, a white-hot core of agony in my chest, but something new was crystallizing around it. Anger, a cold, clear, and focused rage. I thought of the pearl necklace I had given Clara, the one she was wearing right now, a symbol of family and trust wrapped around the throat of a viper. My hands, resting in my lap, clenched into fists. The trembling had stopped. They thought I was a soft touch, an old woman to be pushed aside and manipulated. They had mistaken my love for weakness, my kindness for stupidity. They were about to find out how wrong they were. In the cold moonlight, under the jasmine-scented air, a decision was made. The weeping mother was gone, and in her place, someone else was beginning to rise from the ashes. I didn't go to bed that night. Sleep was an impossible luxury, a country I could no longer visit. Instead, I found myself drawn to my husband's study. I hadn't been in here for months. The door had remained closed, a silent monument to my grief. Tonight, I opened it. The air was still and thick with the scent of old paper, wood polish, and the faint lingering aroma of his pipe tobacco. A layer of dust covered everything, a soft gray blanket over a life put on hold. I ran a finger over his desk, tracing a line through the dust. The tears were gone. The hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by something else, something hard and cold and heavy. It was the weight of purpose. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his life's work, his passions. And then, his last words to me, spoken in a voice thinned by illness but still full of love, came back to me with stunning clarity. It wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing instruction. "Maggie," he had whispered, his hand weak in mine. "Don't let them sell the house. Not ever. Inside this house is my true legacy, a part of my soul. The key is where you always used to sit and read to me." At the time, lost in the fog of impending loss, I had thought he was speaking metaphorically. I thought the key was our memories. Now, I knew better. My eyes shot across the room to the corner by the fireplace, to his old armchair. It was a monstrosity of worn, cracked brown leather, with stuffing peeking out of a seam on one side. But it had been his favorite, and the smaller wingback chair beside it. That was where I had spent countless evenings reading to him as he worked. "The key is where you always used to sit and read to me." My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the silent room. I walked over to my chair, my movement stiff and deliberate. I knelt on the floor, my hands tracing the familiar patterns of the upholstery. Nothing. I ran my fingers along the wooden frame, searching for any inconsistency, any seam or button that seemed out of place. My hands moved to the armrests, worn smooth by years of use. And there, on the underside of the right armrest, my fingers brushed against it. A small, almost imperceptible indentation in the wood. I pressed it. With a soft, satisfying click, a section of the armrest popped open, revealing a small hidden compartment no bigger than a shoebox. It was a secret I had sat beside for 30 years and never known existed. My hand was trembling again, but this time it wasn't with grief or fear. It was with anticipation. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay two items. The first was a heavy, ornate, old-fashioned brass key. The second was a small, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. I picked it up and unfolded it. My husband's familiar, elegant script covered the page in just 4 words. Agnes knows the rest. A wave of profound understanding washed over me. This was his plan. His final, brilliant move in a game he knew would be played long after he was gone. He had foreseen the greed, the betrayal. He had left me a map. The pain of Edward's betrayal was still a raw, open wound, but now it had a purpose. It was the fire I needed to walk this path. I was no longer fighting for a house filled with memories. I was fighting to protect the soul of the man I loved, to guard a legacy I was only just beginning to understand. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a guardian. The next morning, I drove to Agnes Porter's law office downtown. Her world was the complete opposite of mine. Where my house was filled with the soft, cluttered warmth of the past, her office was a testament to the sharp, clean lines of the present. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Charleston Harbor, and the furniture was all glass, steel and black leather. It was a space designed for clarity, for battle, for winning. Agnes was more than my best friend. She was the sharpest legal mind I'd ever known. We'd been friends for 50 years, 2 sides of the same coin. I was the quiet librarian. She was the fierce litigator. She was waiting for me in her office, a cup of black coffee already poured. She took one look at my face and knew. There was no need for small talk. "He did it, didn't he?" she said, her voice quiet but laced with a familiar, righteous anger. "The boy finally broke your heart for good." I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my handbag, my fingers closing around the heavy brass key. I walked to her expansive glass desk and placed it on the surface. The sound it made, a solid clunk against the glass, was the only sound in the room. It was a declaration. Agnes looked at the key, then back at me. A slow, grim nod was her only reply. "I was hoping this day would never come, Maggie," she said, her voice softening. "But your husband was a brilliant man. He always played the long game." She rose from her chair and walked to a nondescript filing cabinet against the wall. It looked ordinary, but I knew Agnes better than that. She manipulated a hidden lock, and the front of the cabinet swung open, revealing the heavy steel door of a safe. She spun the dial with practiced ease, and the safe opened with a heavy sigh. From inside, she withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a wax stamp bearing my husband's initial. My breath caught in my throat. She brought it back to the desk and laid it beside the key. My name was written on the front in his beautiful looping handwriting. "He gave this to me a month before he passed," Agnes explained. "His instructions were clear. I was only to give it to you if you brought me the key. He said you would only look for the key if you were in a fight for your life." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long, filled with his words, his voice, his foresight. He told me everything. He wrote about his secret life as a master horologist, a creator of bespoke, one-of-a-kind timepieces for a select group of wealthy and discreet clients. He described the hidden workshop, his true legacy, filled with a collection of his masterpieces, art and engineering so unique they were priceless. And then came the warning. He wrote about a ruthless art broker he'd encountered, a man with an insatiable greed and no morals, who had gotten wind of the collection's existence, a man named Arthur Vance. He warned me that Vance would stop at nothing and that he would likely use Edward's financial desperation as a weapon. My husband had seen it all coming. The final page was a legally binding document drafted by Agnes and signed by him, giving me and Agnes joint, irrevocable power of attorney over his entire estate, specifically the house and its hidden contents. It was airtight. It was a shield and a sword. I finished reading and slowly folded the pages. I was no longer alone. I had my husband's brilliant mind guiding me and my best friend's legal genius standing beside me. The grief and shock that had paralyzed me were burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. My eyes, when I lifted them to meet Agnes's, were no longer filled with the pain of a victim. They were filled with the fire of a fight that was just beginning. They arrived 2 days later, just as I knew they would. I saw their sleek black Mercedes pull into my driveway through the living room window. They walked up the stone path, not like a son and daughter-in-law coming for a visit, but like developers inspecting a property they were about to gut. Their faces were a mixture of impatience and smug confidence. They thought they were coming to deliver the final, gentle push that would send me tumbling into a nursing home. I opened the door before they could knock. "Edward, Clara, please, come in." My voice was calm, even, and it seemed to throw them off balance. They had expected tears, pleading, or at the very least, a bitter argument. They got none of it. "Mom," Edward began, his tone falsely gentle. "We need to talk about arrangements." "Of course we do," I said, gesturing not to the comfortable chairs in the living room, but to the formal dining room. "Let's sit down." They exchanged a look, a flicker of confusion, but followed me. I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table, my late husband's place. They sat opposite me, looking small and out of place. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the chirping of cicadas outside. Clara cleared her throat, ready to launch into her prepared speech, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Before you begin," I said softly, "there are a few things I'd like to show you." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the first item. I slid it across the polished surface of the table. It was a photograph. A crystal clear 8x10 print of Clara and Arthur Vance at the Garden Cafe, the rolled up blueprint clearly visible between them. Clara's practiced smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving 2 bright spots of rouge standing out like warning flags. She stared at the photo as if it were a snake. Edward frowned, leaning in to look. "What's this? Who is that man?" Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my pocket again and produced the second item. It was a folded legal document. I slid it across the table to sit beside the photograph. It was a standard rental agreement, the kind I'd had them sign a year ago to keep things official. Edward unfolded it, his brow furrowed in confusion. I pointed to a specific highlighted clause. "Section C, paragraph 4, I said, my voice still quiet. "The tenants, Edward and Clara Ellison, agree not to make any structural alterations or remove any permanent fixtures or furnishings without the express written consent of the owner, Margaret Ellison." Edward's face went from confused to alarmed. His eyes darted from the contract to Clara, then to me. The trap was beginning to close around him, and he could feel the steel jaws. Finally, I brought out the third item. It was my husband's favorite pocket watch, a beautiful, intricate piece of silver and gold. I held it in the palm of my hand for a moment. Then, with a deliberate motion, I wound the small crown on top. A series of soft, precise clicks echoed in the dead silence of the room. I placed the watch on the table between the photo and the contract. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was deafening. It was the only thing moving, the only thing alive in the sudden, suffocating stillness. It was the sound of a clock counting down, the sound of a bomb. Clara's composure shattered completely. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Edward looked at me, and for the first time, I saw raw, undiluted fear in my son's eyes. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by the panicked realization of a cornered animal. They knew, in the space of a minute, without me raising my voice, without me making a single accusation. They knew. I knew everything, and the game had just changed for good. The meeting was set for the following day at Agnes's office. This was not my territory. It was hers. The cool, impersonal world of law and consequence. When Edward and Clara arrived, they looked pale and sleep-deprived. The smug confidence they had worn like a suit of armor was gone, replaced by a brittle, nervous energy. They were walking into an ambush, and they knew it. We sat around a large glass conference table. I was silent, a spectator. This was Agnes's stage. "Thank you for coming," Agnes began, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. She gestured to a stack of files in front of her. "I believe we can dispense with the pleasantries. We're here to discuss the coordinated effort between yourselves and a Mr. Arthur Vance to defraud Margaret Ellison of her property and assets." Clara started to speak, a protest forming on her lips, but Agnes cut her off with a sharp look. "Please, allow me to finish." Agnes laid out the evidence with the precision of a surgeon. First, she produced copies of loan agreements totaling over $500,000, signed by Edward, with a shell corporation that Agnes had definitively traced back to Vance. The motive was established in black and white. Edward sank lower in his chair, his face ashen. Next, she slid a small tablet across the table and pressed play. Our voices filled the silent room. Edward's, panicked, and Clara's, cold and cruel, captured from the garden on the night of the wedding. "Your mother is a soft touch," Clara's recorded voice sneered. "She'll break." It was the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of their conspiracy. Edward let out a choked sob and buried his face in his hands. He was broken. He confessed everything in a torrent of pathetic excuses. The crushing debt, Vance's threats, the promise of a new life. He was a man drowning, and he had tried to use me as a life raft. But while Edward was crumbling, I watched Clara. Her face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. She wasn't panicking. She was processing. I could see the gears turning in her mind as she assessed the wreckage of her plan. She looked at her weeping, defeated husband with something bordering on contempt. He was useless to her now. The game was over. It was time to find a new one. Then, in a move of stunning audacity, Clara stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to use the restroom," she stammered, feigning distress. Agnes nodded curtly. As soon as Clara was out of the room, my phone, which I had placed on the table, vibrated. I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. On a hunch, I answered it, putting it on speaker. "Hello? Margaret. It's me." It was Clara, her voice a frantic, terrified whisper. She was clearly calling from the hallway. "Listen to me. You have to listen. Vance isn't going to let me walk away from this. He knows I know too much about his other deals. He'll silence me permanently." I was speechless. The sheer nerve of her was breathtaking. "I'm not like Edward," she rushed on, her voice trembling. Whether from fear or adrenaline, I couldn't tell. "I'm not weak. I have everything. I have copies of all of Vance's ledgers, offshore account numbers, proof of his money laundering, everything you need to destroy him for good. Help me, Margaret. Give me a deal. Let me walk away, and I will hand you the man who put this whole nightmare in motion." I'll give you Arthur Vance on a silver platter." I looked across the table at Agnes, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and grudging admiration. My son was sobbing, a broken man. And the woman who had orchestrated his downfall, the woman who had publicly humiliated me, was now offering me a devil's bargain. She was offering me the chance to trade one villain for another, to trust the snake who had bitten me in order to slay the dragon. We took the deal. It was a pact with the devil. But as Agnes said, sometimes you have to use a monster to catch a bigger one. Clara, true to her word, delivered everything. The ledgers, the offshore account numbers, the irrefutable proof of a criminal enterprise far larger than we had imagined. Armed with her evidence, the authorities moved in. Arthur Vance and his associates were arrested in a series of quiet, efficient raids. His empire of greed, built on intimidation and fraud, came crashing down, and Clara, she vanished. As part of her deal for immunity, she was given a new identity, Toddy, and a plane ticket to somewhere far away. She disappeared without a word, a ghost leaving behind nothing but the wreckage she had caused. A week later, when the dust had settled, I knew it was time. I found Edward in the living room, staring blankly at the wedding photo of him and Clara on the mantelpiece. He looked like a stranger in my house, a hollowed-out version of the son I once knew. "Come with me, Dee," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I led him through the house to my husband's study. I walked to the old wingback chair and pressed the hidden latch. The secret compartment clicked open. I took out the heavy brass key and walked to the wall of bookshelves. I inserted the key into a lock I had never noticed before, disguised as the center of a carved wooden rosette. I turned it. There was a low groan, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing not a dark passage, but a short, steep staircase leading down. A light flickered on automatically, casting a warm glow from below. I led my son down the stairs and into his father's soul. It wasn't a dusty, forgotten workshop. It was a sanctuary. A pristine, perfectly organized space that was part laboratory, part artist studio. Glass cases lined the walls, each containing a single, breathtaking timepiece. They weren't just watches. They were miniature worlds of gears and jewels, each one a masterpiece of design and engineering. On a long workbench, tools were laid out with surgical precision next to half-finished movements and detailed schematics. Edward stopped in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified awe. This was the legacy he had been willing to sell for a pittance. This was the genius of the father he thought he knew, a man he had dismissed as a simple, quiet craftsman. The weight of what he had almost thrown away seemed to crush him. I never knew," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No," I said softly. "You never bothered to look." I walked to my husband's desk and picked up a single, sealed envelope, the last one. It was addressed to Edward. I handed it to him. His hands trembled as he opened it and read the words his father had written for him. I didn't need to see it to know what it said. It was a letter of love, of disappointment, and of a father's final, desperate hope for his son's character. When he finished reading, a sound of pure animal grief was torn from his throat. He collapsed to his knees on the floor, the letter falling from his limp fingers, and he wept. He cried with the force of a man whose entire world had been shattered, whose own reflection had become that of a monster. I let him cry for a long time. When his sobs finally subsided into ragged gasps, I placed a hand on his shoulder. My touch was not gentle, not forgiving. It was firm. "Your father's legacy is not for sale," I said, my voice clear and steady as stone. "You will not receive a single dollar from it. Your inheritance is this, a choice. You can leave now and never come back, or you can stay here. You can work to protect this place. You can learn the value of honor, of creating something with your own two hands instead of taking it. That is your only path to redemption. The only one. He looked up at me, his face a ruin of tears and shame. He had lost the money, the wife, the life he had betrayed me for. But in that moment, in that sacred room, he was being offered the one thing he didn't deserve, a chance to earn back his soul. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of what was no longer just my house. It was now the Ellison Watchmaking Legacy and Museum Foundation, a name that felt solid and permanent. The air, once thick with secrets and sorrow, was now filled with the gentle, harmonious ticking of dozens of clocks and the scent of fresh coffee and lemon oil. The silence of grief had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful hum of activity. I was in the workshop, the sanctuary, standing beside a young, gifted artisan named Ben. He was hunched over a workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to assemble a particularly complex escapement mechanism. "You're fighting it," I said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Don't force it. Feel the rhythm. Let the pieces tell you where they want to go." He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and respect. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and tried again. This time, the tiny gears slid into place with a soft, satisfying click. A wide grin spread across his face. "I'll be damned," he whispered. I smiled back. This was my new purpose. Not just guarding a legacy, but sharing it, nurturing it, watching it grow in the hands of a new generation. I left him to his work and walked into the main gallery, the former living room. The heavy, dark furniture was gone, replaced by sleek, climate-controlled glass display cases. And there, cleaning the glass on one of the main displays, was Edward. He wore simple work clothes, khakis and a plain blue shirt. His movements were slow, meticulous, and humble. There was a quiet dignity to him that I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He was thinner, and the shadows under his eyes spoke of long hours and difficult nights, but the desperate, haunted look was gone. He was no longer a man looking for a shortcut. He was a man paying his dues, one day at a time. He looked up and saw me watching him. Our eyes met across the room. There were no words. There didn't need to be. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of acknowledgement, of respect. I nodded back, a silent acceptance of the path he was on. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fragile and perhaps more real, a shared understanding that this was the only way forward. I walked out onto the front porch, the wide piazza that wrapped around the side of the house. Agnes was already there, sitting in one of the wicker chairs, 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the small table between them. She'd let herself in, as she had for the past 50 years. "He's looking better," she said, her gaze fixed on the rising sun that was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "He's working hard," I replied, sinking into the chair beside her. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. The coffee was strong and black, just the way I liked it. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 old friends watching a new day begin. The air was cool and clean, and the world felt full of possibility. The battle was over. The villains were gone. But my victory didn't come from their defeat. It came from this, from the quiet peace of the morning, from the purpose I found within these walls, from the knowledge that I hadn't just saved a collection of objects. I had transformed a house of pain into a home for a legacy, a place of creation and learning. I had found my freedom, not in revenge, but in rebuilding. I had won. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, Feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.